Hello and welcome along. So today we're going to talk about the flagships of the Primarchs. So during the Great Crusade, the Emperor, as a gift for his sons, the Primarchs, had a class of ship called the Gloriana class built, and that ship would almost inevitably become the flagship of that Primarch's legion's fleet. There are a couple of grey areas in there and some things we'll come back to, but essentially that is the case. So these vessels, the Gloriana class battleships, were so large, they were larger than any other vessels created during the Great Crusade period, except for right at the very end where the Abyss class was built by the Wordbearers in secret. There were 3 of these built, but they were built right at the end of the Great Crusade for the Horus Heresy, and so you can ignore them for now. So these Gloriana class vessels that were built on the orders of the Emperor were essentially superior to any other ship that the Imperium had in both size and quality. So they were extremely large and extremely well made, heavily armoured, heavily armed, and designed in a way that not only were they very powerful warships, they were also capable of transporting huge numbers of troops and supporting, including things like attack fighters, bombers, landing craft, gunships, etc. And so they almost always formed the core of the expeditionary fleet commanded by any particular legion. And on their own, they were a match for most other fleets. So although each legion, each Primarch had access to at least one of these Gloriana class vessels, there were some of them that stood out more than others. And these are the ones we're going to talk about today. Perhaps give a judgment on which one was the best. So let's start off with a very strong candidate, the Invincible Reason. So the Invincible Reason was the flagship of the Lion and the Dark Angels Legion. It was the first one built, and it was the largest. So it was believed to be 28 kilometers long. I mean, that's big by anyone's calculations. Now, there was considerable variation amongst this class, and in fact, it's almost wrong to call it a class because they're all so different. Each Primarch had their own very specific ideas and style, etc., and they did impose this on their flagships. So when we say that each Primarch was given a Gloriana class battleship, it's almost like each one was its own subclass. And in fact, some of them are so different that they should really be considered a different class. Perhaps they just retain that name, the Gloriana class, to make it sound like it's all equal. There were huge differences in the size of these vessels, and of course differences in the style, so they looked very different to each other. Now that could largely be put down to aesthetics, but also there is a doctrine element as well, which is understandable because the Primarchs want a vessel that fits the way that they would fight. But with the size difference, maybe you can't help but see some favoritism going on. Now, so as we said, the largest of all was the Lion's flagship, the Invincible Reason, and that was built first. And being the first Legion and the first Primarch, in many ways, you could argue, well, the Lion deserved to get the first one. But he also got the one that was considerably bigger than all of the others. Now, well, there were some others that came close, but his was amongst a small group that were significantly bigger than the others, to the point where it does feel a bit unfair. So the Invincible Reason was certainly one of the most powerful of all of them, perhaps the most. It does appear to have been a well-balanced design, very capable. It fought at the forefront of Imperial fleet actions from quite early in the Great Crusade, all the way through to the present day in the 40k universe, going through many, many major battles, coming out victorious against incredible odds, and somehow still surviving. The Lion was, of course, a naturally gifted commander, and he wasn't limited to ground actions. He was a very capable naval commander as well, and so the Invincible Reason was used by him to great effect throughout the Great Crusade and during the Heresy. So it has to go down as one of the very best, if not the best, flagships of the Primarchs. Now, the second to be built, and also the second largest, was the Macragge's Honour. So that is, as you would guess from the name, the flagship of the Ultramarines and, of course, their Primarch Guilliman. So now I think it's a little bit odd that Guilliman had the second one built. He's not the second Primarch by number. He wasn't the second found. So it does seem a bit strange. And also, it was slightly smaller than the Lions, 2 kilometers shorter, but still significantly bigger than most of the others. And it does feel like there's quite a lot of favoritism going on here. I don't really understand why the Emperor would give Guilliman this ship that kind of marks him out as being superior or better to the others, or being more liked more favoured perhaps by the Emperor. It's a bit of an odd signal to send to the other Primarchs, you know. Okay, guys, I'm going to give you all your own incredible battleship. Yeah, here's yours, Lion. Yeah, great, isn't it? It's amazing. Who's next? I think. Gilliman. Yeah, Gilliman. Yes, here's your one. Yeah, I know it's slightly smaller, but no one else has got one yet, so shut up. It's kind of weird. Anyway, obviously a very powerful ship. It was, of course, very effective, used by Gilliman and the Ultramarines throughout the Heresy and a large proportion of the Great Crusade to great effect. And, of course, it survives to the present day as well. So another great survivor of the Gloriana class. Most of them didn't survive, by the way. So the fact that any of them do survive, has got to give that ship at least some credit anyway. Again, a very strong contender for the most powerful. I would argue that although there's nothing particularly remarkable about it in terms of it wasn't the best at anything, and because the Invincible Reason is also pretty standard, but also bigger, and their records are pretty similar, you have to give it to the Invincible Reason as being slightly better. Now, the next one I'm going to talk about is the Ironblood, which is the flagship of the Iron Warriors, Perturabo. Now, this is an interesting one because, generally speaking, the Gloriana class vessels were supposed to have been built in the solar system, either Jupiter or Mars. And so it is a little bit strange when you read up about the Ironblood. It seems to have been built in the orbital shipyards of Olympia, which is the homeworld of the Iron Warriors. Now, this would make it unique amongst the Gloriana class vessels, not having been built by the Mechanicum in the solar system. So again, a bit of an outlier. Now, it was said to have been built to Perturabo's own designs, and for its construction to be personally overseen by him. And so it's very different from many of the others. It is very, very large, like the previous show I've mentioned. In Perturabo's case, he preferred a slightly shorter, girthier ship. He also preferred no windows. He had a hatred of windows. He didn't like the idea of people looking out at the stars as they went about their business. Perturabo is all about work. So the crew of his ship and anyone being transported on it should only be looking at grey walls, preferably metal. And that is, of course, why he leads the Iron Warriors. Now, although it was winning no prizes in terms of beauty, it appears to have been the most functional, the most efficient vessel. Now, we've got to remember Perturabo is a genius inventor and an incredible engineer, a general builder. He has a capacity to create things that others simply cannot understand. And now, of course, this is largely speculation, but given his incredible talents and his passion for building things, and the fact that he took personal control over building it to his exact designs, you would imagine that this ship is beyond the others in terms of quality, in terms of the capabilities it has. And given that it was one of the largest, I think that that combination of being personally designed and built by him and being so large is evidence enough to put it right up there at the very top tier, and perhaps even number one out of the Gloriana class. Now, some of the Primarchs were quite specialised in their style of warfare, and one of those was the Khan. Now, of course, the Khan favours high-speed warfare, and so his flagship was heavily customised. So the Swordstorm was a Gloriana-class battleship that was heavily modified by the White Scars Tech Marines to make it incredibly fast. So fast that it was the fastest of all of the flagships. Probably not the fastest vessel of all the Imperium, because as a battleship, it is massive, and so probably can't compete with purpose-built high-speed vessels, but as far as battleships go, it was incredibly fast. And not just top speed, but incredible acceleration, which allowed it to perform tactics that the White Scars really favoured. They had a particular style of warfare which relied on rapid acceleration, which would surprise their enemies and allow them to appear to not be reacting and then suddenly react so fast that it was impossible to outmaneuver them. So it was a vessel that was perfectly crafted to meet the White Scars' style of warfare and the Khan's needs. Probably not enough to put it above the others that I've mentioned so far. Now, another heavily modified version was the Shadow of the Emperor. Now, this is the Raven Guard's vessel, so Corax's flagship. So this was modified to be the stealthiest of all of the Gloriana-class battleships, and as you would expect from the Raven Guard. It had a special shield design called the Reflex Shield that essentially trapped all radiation coming from the vessel and dissipated it, so that there was no way of detecting a vessel with its reflex shields raised. Now, this was a special technology that the Raven Guard developed and used on their vessels. But in this case, it was particularly impressive because it was being used on such a huge vessel and it was still effective. It made the vessel essentially invisible, but it did have some downsides. So it did mean that you had to run the vessel at very low power because it was hard to conceal the power behind these shields, and it reduced the range of the sensors of the vessel using the shield. So it meant it was quite hard for you to see what anyone else was doing, so you were kind of running half blind. But it was very effective when used with the right tactics by the right people. So when the Raven Guard used it, it was something that won them many engagements and also allowed them to escape when they needed to as well. I don't think being the stealthiest of the flagships is quite enough to put it at the very top. And now another one of the Gloriana class battleships that was built to very exacting standards was the Pride of the Emperor. Now, this was built for Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children, and it said that he had such incredibly high standards, such exacting standards, that it took twice as long to build as any other vessel of its size. And so that implies that it was probably built to a very high quality. And of course, being a Gloriana class vessel, it would have been very large. However, as I said earlier in the video, the class is a very loose term here, and the size of the Pride of the Emperor is not clear and was probably not anywhere near as big as some of the others. And in fact, most of them seem to have been about half the size of the very largest ones. And so, although built to exacting standards, it probably wasn't as militarily capable as these biggest ones. And on top of that, Fulgrim had the taste for the finer things, and he incorporated that into the design of the Pride of the Emperor. So you could argue that quite a lot of that time building was actually wasted on things that were of no value in the war. And I'm sure Perturabo would argue that. Although Perturabo built his ship to exacting standards and Fulgrim built his to exacting standards, I think that Perturabo's were 100% about making it the most effective vessel he could build, whereas Fulgrim's were about much more than that, making essentially a floating palace. And so for that reason, I wouldn't put it up at the top. Now, you might be thinking, well, where's Horus in all of this? Surely, as the most favoured son of the Emperor, he got the best one. Well, for some reason, he didn't. But he did get a very powerful vessel. So the Vengeful Spirit was huge. It was bigger than most of the other flagships, but it wasn't quite as big as the very largest. It was probably about fourth or fifth in size, but certainly close to the size of the largest one, so in that sort of 20-kilometre range plus. So perhaps double the size of some of the other Primarchs flagships, but not absolutely the biggest. However, Horus did get something which the others didn't get, which was he got two of them. So he was given the Vengeful Spirit and the Harbinger of Doom. So these were twin vessels, so they were identical and absolutely huge. And so when you've got two absolutely huge vessels, the fact that your vessel isn't quite the biggest doesn't matter quite so much. And so that's basically how the Emperor showed his love for Horus, by giving him two. So how do we judge that? So you could say individually the Vengeful Spirit or the Harbinger of Doom were not quite at the top, but together they certainly were. So it's probably not fair to say, well, we'll count them as one, but we could say that the Lunar Wolves and Horus had more firepower in that two together than any of the others had in their Gloriana class vessels, because they only had one, but individually the Vengeful Spirit doesn't quite make the very top. Now, some of you might be thinking, wow, but what about the Alpha Legion? They had two, didn't they? Because they had two flagships, the Alpha and the Beta. Well, yeah, probably. And they do seem that they were technically Gloriana class. They seem to have been part of that group that was smaller, significantly smaller, perhaps half the size of the very biggest ones. And so, therefore, they don't rank up there. What Horus had uniquely was two very large vessels, whereas Alpharius Omegan had two relatively small, very large vessels, if you see what I mean. So for that reason, that's why I wouldn't put them up in that top tier. So which is the best? Well, out of all of those, I would have to say it's got to be between the Invincible Reason and the Iron Blood. You know, it really comes down to how much faith you put into Perturabo's own designs versus the Mechanicum. I think I would go with Perturabo, and the fact that his vessel isn't quite as long as the Invincible Reason, I would discount and not worry too much about. He makes up for it in his own personal designs and the fact that it's probably just a lot chunkier. there you go. That's my opinion on the Gloriana class. But before we finish, there's one other flagship that I haven't mentioned because it's not a Gloriana class battleship. However, it is incredibly powerful and far more powerful than any of the other Primarchs flagships. And that is the Phalanx. So yes, the Phalanx. This is the flagship and massive mobile star fortress of the Imperial Fists. And of course, Ruggle Dawn. So Dawn actually brought this with him when he joined the Imperium. When he was found, he already had it. That's a pretty impressive thing to bring into the Imperium. And it is so massive, it's a size of a small moon. It is incredibly powerful. And not only is it massive, it was built during the Dark Age of technology. And so is built from technology that the Mechanicum simply can't understand. It's so advanced that it, in fact, is slowly degrading over time. And so in the present 40k universe, people just don't know how to maintain it. So it's falling into disrepair and eventually it won't be able to be used. But back during the Great Crusade, it was still at its peak. It was incredibly powerful, incredibly capable. And although the technology wasn't really understood, it was more understood than it is now. And it was still functioning very effectively. So there you have an enormous vessel that is also superior technologically to everything else, and so is by far the most powerful flagship of any of the Primarchs. Now, on top of this, Dawn actually got given a Gloriana class battleship as well, which almost seems unfair. So I suppose Emperor couldn't hold it back and say, well, you've got your own one, haven't you? And he's like, yeah, but I brought that with me. I paid for that. If I want my own one. If you're giving gifts out, you've got to give me the same gift as the other ones. That's not very fair, is it? And as we know, the Emperor is very fair and even-handed. So, number one is by far the Phalanx. Okay, so let me know what you think in the comments. Have I missed one that stood out to you? Could there be any other choice than the Phalanx? Let me know. It'd be great to hear from you. And as always, please like, subscribe, and share.